Suspended production of cars, delayed PlayStation, or problems with the production of smartphones and everything that has one specific component, semiconductors. So far, you have probably never heard of semiconductor production, as I did, but everything has been changed by the crisis associated with the pandemic, which has helped the problems to show. In this video, we will talk more about the problems with semiconductor manufacturing. We will say why the increased demand is not too easy to satisfy and why the leaders of the largest economies go to Taiwan to negotiate. The first problem in the chip manufacturing sector began even before the pandemic, back in 2019, when Donald Trump banned US technology companies from selling their Huawei products.
Huawei is a company we may not do business with at all.
What has happened? After Trump's move, US chip makers like Qualcomm, Broadcom and Intel tried to sell as many Huawei chips as possible before the ban came into force. Mobile phone manufacturers are valuable business partners for chip manufacturers. On the other hand, other mobile phone manufacturers try to produce as many mobile phones as possible and fill the hole in the market that would come after the ban. The pandemic and changes in demand for some products, such as computers and other equipment needed for work or play from home, were just the icing on the cake. The closed factories did not help the situation either, as we know very well that in the globalized world and the long production chains, it will make a very messy situation. For this reason, car makers have production outages and stopped production, as they are less important partners for chip manufacturers and give higher priority to other customers. But we will talk about that later. You might say, okay, let's wait and it will get back to normal. And if not, we will build new factories for their production. But making more sophisticated chips is not easy at all. And even with the final products, the need for quality and complexity of chips is different. For example, simple chips include new cars, as well as refrigerators. On the contrary, mobile phones and, for example, the iPhone 11 contain several more sophisticated chips from large manufacturers. And the paradox is that some of these manufacturers don't even have their own factories and only have patents and their own development. But we will talk about that further. The market for semiconductor or sophisticated chip manufacturers is largely consolidated. In translation, there are several world-class players and the barrier to entry is huge. This means that you need billions of dollars to build a factory of at least simple chips. In addition, the chips are getting smaller and more powerful. While in 1971, the Intel 4004 contained more than 2000 transistors or basic logic elements, so in the 90s there were already chips with 1 million transistors. Today, iPhone has a chip with 12 billion transistors, and it's still not the most powerful on the market. In 50 years, computing speed and memory capacity have increased 8.5 billion times. In short, Moore's law in practice. And why is it so expensive to build a factory? Because you need a lot of special machines for tens of millions of dollars, lasers, a special environment, and completely clean rooms and sometimes hectoliters of water. The rooms where the chips are made are many times cleaner than the operating rooms in hospitals. To give you an idea, 10 cubic particles of dust are acceptable for 1 cubic meter for chip production. In hospitals in surgery, it is 1,000 times more. Of course, in this production there is a minimum number of people who are in a special suits. And as for water, one of the top 3 producers in the world, the Taiwanese company TSMC, consumes 265 million liters of water a day. It's twice the daily consumption of Prague, where live 1.3 million people. We will rather not mention the components needed for the production of chips here, as it is a relatively complicated science. But you probably understand that it's not Lego folding. But just to give you an idea, There is an internal joke in the industry that is not the rocket science, because it is much more complicated. And now the consolidation of the market. Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, which was founded in 1987 by now 89-year-old Maurice Cheng, has a special position on the market. The company has reached the top of the semiconductor scene in more than 30 years and currently has a market capitalization of $600 billion, making it the 11th most valuable company in the world. TSMC and other smaller companies in Taiwan, which also actually produce chips, account for 65% of the sector's total revenue. And we are talking about the whole world. Company alone generates 56% of all revenues in the sector. What makes TSMC so special? It currently produces 92% of most sophisticated chips that we carry in our smartphones or tablets, and that have transistors less than 1,000th the size of the hair. The remaining 8% of the market is manufactured by Samsung Electronics. By the way, you can find chips in the mobile phones, for example, under the Apple or Qualcomm brand. But these companies only design chips and own patents and licenses, but factory which produce them belongs to the TSMC. In the sector of less complicated chips, which go to cars, for example, TSMC produces around 60% of all chips, with its total share of total chip production worldwide being around 35%. This was not always the case. In 90s, companies like Nvidia, Intel and Qualcomm produced 37% of all chips in the world. At present, they have a share of only 12%. In short, TSMC has huge power over the production of chips in the world, which are increasingly used in products and are becoming more and more complicated. And why do car manufacturers have a problem? Because their chips make up only 4% of the revenue of TSMC, which has already shifted capacity during the pandemic and met the demand of smartphone productions. Of course, world leaders realized that this is not the best business model for the production of an increasingly important component to be on the shoulder of a small island company. Biden have a plan to invest $50 billion in domestic chip production. European Union would like to have 20% of the world's chip production in European countries by 2030, as part of a plan to build a digital industry for $150 billion. Also, the American manufacturer Intel would like to build 2 chip factories at home for $20 billion. At the same time, members of Germany and the USA are pushing for TSMC to increase the company's production capacity and thus help their car makers. The company argue that they increase the production of their chips by 60% compared to 2020. The problem with building new factories is the fact that once you miss a train, it's hard to catch up. One semiconductor factory can cost $20 billion, and one machine for more advanced chips can cost $100 million. Just to give you an idea, Slovakia's annual GDP is about $100 billion. TSMC alone plans to spend $100 billion over the next 3 years. According to analysts, in order for companies to catch up with the missed train, they would have to spend $30 billion over 5 years to keep up with TSMC or Samsung. TSMC is also a geopolitical tool that is referred to as Taiwanese Silicon Shield. Of course, the government itself helped with the capacity injection with the establishment of the company. Nevertheless, the company has exploited a hole in the market and the reluctance of American manufacturers to produce chips in recent years, and it has become a market leader in the production of more or less sophisticated chips and can now dictate terms. Analysts currently predict that the gap between demand and supply in chip production may persist until 2023. The reason is the coming third wave, growing demand for devices with increasingly complex chips, but also cryptocurrency mining. And what about European plans? These are more ambitious than the American ones, For a simple reason. The vast majority of companies in the sector are based in the USA and Asia. There are only a few of them in Europe. While in the 90s, European companies accounted for 30 to 40% of the production of more complex but also simpler chips, today it's only around 9%, and most of the chips in Europe are just being designed. The US also has the advantage that it has already started negotiations with Asian companies, as well as with TSMC, to open chip production to them as well. The Taiwanese companies does not see the potential in Europe, due to the fact that it focuses more on simpler chips for cars, and currently less than 10% of chips from TSMC factories go to Europe. In translation, this means that they are not an essential partner for them. Negotiations between companies in the sector and American and European leaders are still ongoing, and it's questionable how this will end up. Some analysts prefer to invest and expand domestic companies in Europe, so that they are not completely dependent on production in Asia. Nevertheless, in today's globalized world, a kind of cheap self-sufficiency is utopia rather than a reasonable goal. And don't forget, if you like this video, I will be happy to subscribe to Homo Economicus channel so you don't miss my next production of videos focused on economic topics.